that it was a delight, and it took him into a whole new life inspiration and imagination for him.
As a child, Churchill didn't really show any indication that painting or the arts in general were of interest to him. Winston Churchill came late to painting at age 40 in 1915, after he was forced to resign his position as First Lord of the Admiralty after the disastrous Dardanelles campaign at Gallipoli. Churchill took the blame. He retreated then in despair, somewhat depressed, to Hoe Farm and shared that cottage with his brother Jack and his sister-in-law Gwendolyn, who encouraged Churchill to pick up a brush. From that point, 1915, had a love affair with painting and did 530 plus canvases.
In one of the paintings in this lovely show here, called Terrace at Trent Park, it's a beautiful painting with light streaming through. He says in a little book he wrote called Painting as a Pastime that before he started painting, he had just looked at nature and landscapes in a general sort of way, and he never really realized it and never appreciated it as much as when he had painted.
Churchill never studied formally. He boldly went into it on his own, as he did so many things in life. One painting in particular, done in 1938, called Beach at Walmer, is a terrific example of the overlapping worlds of Churchill's painting and Churchill's politics. It didn't happen often, and this family bathing in the sand, off in the distance across the English Channel, you can imagine a looming Nazi threat. And Churchill places, rather boldly, a cannon on the beach, as if to say, we must arm. During the Casablanca conference, when Churchill and Roosevelt gathered to discuss plans for the war. After the conference in Casablanca had ended, Churchill, and only Churchill could do this, invited Roosevelt to travel via motorcade across the desert to the city of Marrakesh, the Paris of the Sahara as he called it, to witness the sunset on the Atlas Mountains. Roosevelt then left the conference, returning to the United States. Churchill asked his assistants and aides to fetch his paint box, and he painted this painting, which he later gave to Roosevelt to commemorate this wonderful occasion.
Well, I don't think he was thinking of ambition when he was painting. He had enough time to think of that. I think he was actually immersed in the enjoyment of it. And of course, it is the challenge to finish a painting, and you have to stay at it.
Churchill once said that without painting, he could not live. And I think that's a very important thing for us to remember. Painting slowed down the life of Winston Churchill, allowed him to concentrate, to really relieve some of the stresses of his normal routine.
Welcome to Gaslit Nation. In part 2 of my discussion with Robert Schmuhl, author of the new book, Mr. Churchill in the White House, we're going to discuss Churchill's art therapy. You know how I'm always saying art is survival? Churchill leading the free world against fascism depended on his art therapy. Making art, being creative, losing yourself in your beautiful intuition is central to the work we're all doing. So find the artist inside of you. The world will be better for it. To hear the full discussion, be sure to become a member of our Gaslit Nation Patreon community at patreon.com/gaslit. Discounted annual memberships are available. If you're already a member, you can give the gift of membership to someone in your life. And if you're not already a member, you can try it out for free. Thank you to everyone who supports the show, especially in these times. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you. On Monday, at our Gaslit Nation salon over Zoom with our Patreon community, we'll be joined by disinformation researcher Dr. Emma Bryant. Dr. Bryant was involved in exposing the Facebook Cambridge Analytica data scandal. She is the co-author of the Routledge Handbook of the Influence Industry, which features a chapter on law warfare or lawfare written by my sister, Alexandra Chalupa. Dr. Bryant will talk to us about influence campaigns. How do they work? And how do we overcome them? If you want to know what an influence campaign is, look at MAGA extremism.
Could you speak a little bit about his art therapy? Churchill was a prolific painter.
He was, and he was a very, very successful and talented artist. It harks back to your question about the black dog. After the really during the First World War and its aftermath, of the Great War, so-called. He had a down period. There was the Gallipoli decision, and he lost the First Lord of the Admiralty post.
What was the Gallipoli decision?
That was the decision to try to bring forces in that would interrupt the German assault. And actually, the forces would have come in and joined with the Russians and allowed for more ability to fight around the Dardanelles, which is around Turkey and that area, okay? And it ran into enormous problems. The casualties were quite high. And Churchill was blamed for it, was blamed for the strategy and really the execution of it, and paid an enormous political price for it. And it hung over his head. And so when you said a few minutes ago about him becoming prime minister, during the 20s and 30s, that whole shadow followed him wherever he went. And he had to overcome that to become prime minister. But anyway, he is depressed and takes up art and starts painting. And he is quite talented and would spend time, particularly in and around the Mediterranean, whether it would be south of France or Morocco or wherever, Como in Italy. And he painted and painted. And in 1958, has a show, a big show that the Smithsonian Institution sponsors in the United States of some of his paintings. Some of his paintings today, if they go on sale, are going for tens of millions of dollars. Now, it's not only certainly the artistry, it's the man who did it. But I would encourage your listeners sometime to just Google and call up some of the paintings that he did, and you would say, now this is someone who really is incredible in terms of, it's quite wondrous.
Was he classically trained? How did he?
No, pretty much self-trained. Someone, an artist, encouraged him to take it up. And
to feel better, not to take it up like I see innate talent in you, but just as a way to express himself during a dark time.
A hobby that would distract you from your depression. Let's talk at it like that. There's a wonderful story of a executive from Time Life. And Life magazine in 1946, January of 1946, people can call this up, devoted a cover story to Winston Churchill's paintings and color photographs of his paintings, a wonderful cover picture of him in his studio painting away. But this executive from Time Life was talking to him one time, came up and admired one of his paintings and said so to Winston Churchill. And Churchill said straight out, genius has many outlets. Now, that is self-confidence to a degree that many of us would not have, but that would be Winston Churchill, who could paint, who could write, who could speak, who could lead, and who could live in the White House for days on end, much to the, what would you say, nervous exhaustion of Eleanor Roosevelt.
He was a creative force.
Yes, he was creative and used that creativity in many different ways. I think some of his writing is brilliant. Well, let's face it, in 1953, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. The story goes that there was a call saying the Nobel Committee is trying to reach you. And he, of course, goes, oh my goodness, the Nobel Peace Prize, blah, blah, blah. And he gets it for literature. So, it's not what I expected, but he deserved it, I guess.
What's interesting is that Churchill, coming from the Victorian age, that was a time when men of the elites, as he was, were expected to go into military glory. Europe was used to wars, and so men were built for war. And if he didn't have those constraints, maybe if he was born today, he might have become an artist first and foremost, rather than a leader, a politician, a military official at one point. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's interesting. The reason that he followed the military career is that he was unable to go to university. So he went to Sandhurst and graduated from there, and then goes into the military for a number of years, as I say, in India and elsewhere, Sudan and South Africa. But what is charming, as far as I'm concerned, is during those first years, he combined serving in the military with writing about the experience of being in the military.
Like Hemingway.
In a way like Hemingway, except a little bit different in the sense that in Hemingway's case, and correct me if I'm wrong, he is writing more about his experience as an ambulance driver and stuff, right? In the First World War. In the Second World War, he's the well-known, famous author who goes to Paris as soon as it's liberated, and he liberates the Ritz Hotel and all that stuff and writes magazine pieces about that. What I'm suggesting is with Churchill, he would go on these military campaigns as a military person and then write letters back to the newspaper that had contracted with him to explain what was happening. And then Churchill, being Churchill, would collect those letters into books that then became popular. He comes to the United States after one of the books comes out for a lecture tour because he's so well known as the writer who was involved in these military campaigns. And who introduces him in the United States, at least at one lecture? Mark Twain. You can't make this stuff up. And finally, the British officials put sort of a directive out that military people could not write about the campaigns that they were engaged in as long as they were serving in the army or whatever service it would be. He was responsible for that.
So he was a showman through and through. And I want to add important context for Hemingway. Hemingway saw action in the Great War. He was injured.
Yeah.
And he also was in Spain, which was during the Spanish Civil War. And he tried to see some action in World War II. And yes, he was very drunk and very famous during his time in World War II. But he was gunning for some action. But he understood at the same time that he was nearing his end of appetite for adventure. So I think Winston Churchill's upbringing is really interesting because he was born into status. He was born into title. He was born into rich ancestry, but he himself, he was title rich, cash poor. And that is what forced him to go into the military then.
And when you say cash poor, the articles and then the books that he wrote became very important to him because he was always a high liver and wanted the best of everything. And so he's serving in the military, but then also writing about serving in the military. And he's getting two benefits, shall we say, from that. Interestingly enough, his American-born mother was the person most responsible for making connections with the newspapers and publishers back in London. And so she, Jenny Jerome, who was known for being very friendly with people, was able to set up these deals. And then Winston fulfilled them, would write the books, and then would go about the countryside giving talks and being paid for that. And as I say, comes to the United States, even meets the president at that time, William McKinley. That, as much as I could tell, was the first time he ever set foot in the White House. He is a showman. He knows that he has a strong personality and that the personality can get him places. And so he's going to do everything he can to make that occur.
What advice do you think Churchill would have for us today in America, where we have a robust fascist threat in the MAGA movement that's taken over the Republican Party and is increasing its influence in Congress? We just had MAGA, through Mike Johnson, hold up aid to Ukraine for 6 critical months, giving Russia, a fascist dictatorship, the advantage on the battlefield. What do you think Churchill would say to us today, and how we can get through this political crisis in America, not just for us here at home, but for democracies around the world, certainly NATO and Ukraine?
This will be a critical comment on the former president, Donald Trump. I always found it somewhat irksome that the bust of Churchill was over Donald Trump's shoulder, often in pictures from the Oval Office. My guess is that he wanted it there to show strength, toughness, all of that. Donald Trump and Winston Churchill couldn't be more different.